Tonight we are going to continue our look at Daniel. We're going to be in the 7th chapter. If you want to turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 7. Um, if you remember, for those of you that have been with us, we'll be doing a little bit of review tonight. And that's because some of you weren't here and some of you have short memories and some of you just weren't listening in the first place. But we're going to, if you remember, the first 6 chapters are coming from primarily an historical perspective. There are some prophecies contained in them, but they are essentially historical, and they are written in the third person. Even though Daniel is the author, he speaks in third person. But then the last 6 chapters, chapters 7 through 12, are predominantly prophetic, even though there's some history contained in them. They're predominantly prophetic, and they're also written in first person. Daniel began speaking as the author. And if you think back to chapter 2, there was this great vision that Nebuchadnezzar had of this metallic image, the multi-metallic image, where the head of gold, of course, Daniel told him, was not only the Babylonian Empire, but it was specifically Nebuchadnezzar. And then the arms and the chest of silver were the Medo-Persian Empire. The torso of brass was the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. And the legs of iron was the Roman Empire. And then lastly, the feet that was of mixed iron and clay together was what we're just going to call it, and this is what most of the modern day scholars refer to it as, the revived Roman Empire. And that's going to play into our study tonight. So we have that kind of by way of brief introduction. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions on his head while on his bed, or visions of his head while on his bed. And he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. So it says in the first year of Belshazzar. Now, this is going to be some years, like about 14 years prior to, we were introduced to Belshazzar in chapter 5. He was the handwriting on the wall dude. And that was the night that the kingdom fell. Well, this is about a decade and a half prior to that. So Daniel's a young guy, probably in his mid-60s here. He has a dream where he says that he has a dream, and dream singular, so it's a night thing, but within that dream there are several visions, plural. And he writes it down, telling the main facts. And Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. The Mediterranean Sea was not known as the Mediterranean Sea back in the Bible days. It was simply known as the Great Sea. The guys of the Bible period and the Bible places, that's the only sea they knew of, that and the Red Sea. And so in prophetic language, the sea almost always exclusively refers to the Gentiles. The Israelites were the people of the land. They were given the land. They're land lovers through and through. We don't see very much of anything about the Israelites being seafaring people. And so the sea is oftentimes, prophetically speaking, of the Gentiles. And winds are always used ominously whenever we see them in Scripture. Wait a minute, what's happening here? Okay, I triple-clicked when I meant to double-click. There we go. Winds are, they always speak of, we use the phrase, an ill wind is blowing. And in prophecy, whenever winds are blowing, it's usually not good. And it says the 4 winds. So, of course, these would be the 4 winds. And they're all blowing at the same time, going all different directions. I mean, it'd be like a hurricane, a typhoon, and a cyclone, and a tornado, and a room full of politicians all at the same time, just... and it says, it says that this was going on, where he had this vision of the 4 winds stirring up the great sea. Now, just a little bit of outline of this first part of the chapter, the part of concerning the vision. Verses 2 to 6 are going to talk about these 3 beasts that rise up out of the sea in the midst of this turmoil of the 4 winds blowing at the same time. And then verses 7 through 12 are going to refer to this 4th beast. The first 3 beasts are likened to specific animals, even with some very unique attributes. This fourth beast, Daniel doesn't even know how to describe him. He's what most of the Bible guys say, a nondescript beast, because you can't describe him. And then verses 13 and 14, we see the coming of the Son of Man. And we'll kind of break these down as we go through it. The four winds in Hebrew, the word wind is kind of like the same way in Greek that the word wind and spirit and blow are all the same word, pneuma in Greek. And the same thing is true of Hebrew. The word is ruach, and it's the same word that would be used to refer to the wind or to the spirit or a spirit. And so it could be talking not about the east, west, and north winds and south winds, could be talking about four spirits or angels or spiritual beings. In fact, that may even be a preferable interpretation. And I think if I haven't said this yet, I think it's going to be very important now as we get into this second half of the book where we're looking at the more prophetic aspects of Daniel. The best commentary on the book of Daniel is the book of Revelation. And as I've often said, the best commentary on the book of Revelation is the book of Daniel. The two of them, really, you can't fully understand one of them without the other one. And when you put them two together, it explains a lot of mysteries that many of us might have concerning eschatology or the study of end times. For example, Revelation chapter 7, verse 1 says, "And after these things I saw four angels," I saw four spirits, if you will, standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the sea or on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. So this may be, Revelation chapter 7 may be the same scene that we have in Daniel chapter 7, only just right before that. You know, here the winds aren't blowing because the angels are holding them back. But then when we get to Daniel 7, they are blowing. And as a result of this, there's four great beasts that came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. And I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And so many scholars, and I kind of tend to agree with them. I'm going to qualify that here in a minute. But many scholars see a parallel between chapter 2 with that metallic image of Nebuchadnezzar's vision and chapter 7 and these different kinds of critters that Daniel sees in his vision. And so the first one is this lion, a lion with wings on it. And this would be correspond to Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonian Empire. And lions are so, I mean, they're awesome creatures. You know, they're so regal, they're so stately. I mean, I just watching a lion walk is enough to inspire awe in somebody. They're very regal. They're called the king of the beasts, not because they're the baddest ones going, because as we're going to see in a minute, they're not. But they are the most regal. They're very kingly. And it says that this lion was caused to rise up on 2 legs and like a man. And this, I think, would be the reference to Nebuchadnezzar as the main dude of the Babylonian Empire. But then suddenly, and one of the things about this lion is that it's got wings that get plucked off, that get cut off. And no sooner did Daniel see this vision of the lion with the wings and the wings getting plucked off, that suddenly, it says in verse 5, another beast, a second like a bear, and it was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it. So it's like these ribs were speaking to the beast, and they said, "Arise and devour much flesh." Now, when it says that he had these 3 ribs in his mouth, the guy didn't just come from rib crib, okay? It's not talking about that kind of a thing. But this would correspond to the Medo-Persian Empire, which was the second one in of silver, chest and arms of silver. And it says that he was raised up on one side. One commentator I read meant that had to do with its posture, like it raised up on its hind legs as though it was ready to attack. That's probably not the side that it's talking about. I mean, when I read this and see that it raised up on one side, I think on either the left or the right side, that one side was stronger than the other, if you will. And, many of you are familiar with, my history of being a klutz and how many years ago I had this really bad head-on car accident. I kind of messed up my left leg pretty badly. And then a few years later, I had this very stupid motorcycle accident. I messed up my leg even more worse. And then a few years ago, because of those two accidents, I had an ankle replacement. And I mean, my right leg is just messed. I don't know if you guys have ever seen me run. But it's rather a sight. And I mean, if I were to try to run, because and this leg is actually just about an inch shorter than my left leg, and if I try to run, I just run around in circles, because my left leg is so much more so than my right leg. That's how I picture this guy. This bear. He runs like me. And the three ribs that are coming out of its mouth probably refer to Babylon, Libya, and Egypt. These were three nations that kind of rose up against Persia after Persia took over. And it was originally the Medo-Persian. It was the Medes and the Persians together. They were originally kind of a confederacy, but the Persians were so much stronger. It rose up on one side, and they became so much more powerful that they didn't overthrow or usurp the Medes. They just kind of absorbed them. And then it was later just called the Persian Empire because the Medes became so insignificant. And in their heyday, the Babylonians tried to stage a comeback along with Lydia and Egypt. And so it could be referring to those. Or some people say that it's referring to the three nations that preceded it, the three empires that were of world renown before that, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Egyptians. That may be. Some think that the word ribs, and this is the only place it occurs in the Old Testament, so it's kind of hard, in the ancient Hebrew, if you don't have something to compare it with, sometimes it's hard to understand the true definition of some of the words, but some believe, and I couldn't find any modern English translations that would bear this out, or any English translations for that matter, but some believe that it could be a reference to either fangs or tusks, that it wasn't just simply, I don't know why their fangs would be talking to themselves or talking to them, but I don't know why the ribs would be either. So, one of the things about bears, I mean, as I said, lions are very regal, they're very stately, they're pretty awesome creatures, but bears, if you were to put a grizzly bear and a lion in a room, who's going to walk out? I mean, the lion's going to put up a pretty good fight, but the grizzly bear is going to take him out because they're very powerful. They're not fast, but they don't need to be, and they're just tough. They're just hard to stop, and a grizzly is going to take out a lion like a rock's going to smash scissors, if you put them both together. And so that's what the Persian Empire did to the Babylonians. And then verse 6 says, after this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. So where the lion had 2 wings, this one's got 4. And it doesn't say what kind of bird they're like. It's just 4 like birds, 4 wings. And it says the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, I've seen leopards before, but I've never seen a 4-headed, 4-winged leopard before. So this one's kind of pretty crazy too. And of course, this would correspond to the third of Nebuchadnezzar's medals, the brass torso that is the Greek Empire. Now, unlike bears, who are kind of slow and pondering, but they're powerful, leopards are very fast. They're one of the fastest of the big cats. And Alexander the Great came to the throne when he was barely 20 years old, when he inherited the kingdom from his dad. And before he was 30 years old, before you could say he was even middle-aged, he had conquered all of the so-called civilized world. And there's the saying that he sat down and wept because there were no more kingdoms to conquer. And before his 30th birthday, he did all this. I mean, he just like took his army and all the way from southeastern Europe through the Middle East and even into Asia. And that would be the Greek Empire. And, somebody can say, well, I thought I was coming to church tonight. I didn't know I was coming to a history lesson. But then the fact is that all history is his story. And this is going to kind of serve as somewhat of an introduction to what we're going to be looking at in the next 5 chapters. But I think this is pretty significant. And on his deathbed, it is said that as Alexander was dying, he and his generals were there, and they were all keeping kind of a death watch over him. And he said in this very weak and raspy, hoarse voice as he was breathing his last, "Let my kingdom go to the strong." And his 4 generals were there, and they all kind of looked at each other, and one of them kind of reached for his sword, and the other one reached for his dagger, and the other one pulled out his Glock, and they entered into this civil war for 4 years, each one of them thinking, "I'm going to be the strong one," and they all tried to take the kingdom from the other 3. This went on for a long time. They weren't gaining any ground, so they just decided to divide it up. And I mean, as you can see, Seleucus was evidently the more powerful of the 4 because he got the biggest slice of the pie. And Cassander and Lysimachus, we don't really hear much from them from history. They just kind of, they didn't begin any kind of a dynasty to speak of, and when they were gone, they were gone. But Ptolemy and Seleucus both started these 2 kingdoms. Seleucus was over the area known as pretty much modern-day Syria, and Ptolemy was over the area that would be considered Egypt. And the 2 of them, their descendants, not only them, but their descendants as well, for the next couple of centuries, spent a lot of time fighting each other. And they would have these very brutal battles between them. And of course, if you look at Syria on a map and then you look at Egypt on a map and you think, well, if these 2 countries are going to fight, they'll probably be meeting somewhere in between. And the in-between of Syria and Egypt is Israel. Especially the plain of Megiddo in northern Israel. And that's just a very famous battleground that will probably one day be the staging ground for the so-called Battle of Armageddon. But remember this, because this is going to come into play, especially when we get into the last 3 chapters. This battle between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. And the fact that their tug-of-war, they were like 2 divorced parents playing tug-of-war with the kids, and the kids was Israel. Their tug-of-war through all of this was the nation of Israel. And verse 7 says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. And it had huge iron teeth, and it was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet." So not only was its feet or its teeth pretty powerful, it could like chomp up anything that got in its way, but so were its feet, and it would trample anything that got in its way. Whatever the teeth left over, the feet would trample. They were trampling the residue. It was trampling the residue with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. So not only was it different from all the other ones in the fact that you couldn't liken it to any, there wasn't any kind of animal characteristic that stood out like a lion or a bear or a leopard. Daniel's like, I don't know. But I saw 10 horns. I saw it had that. And so far, if we were to look at the description, this would fit very, and of course a lot of the guys think that can't describe it, so we'll just make it look like a dinosaur. But so far, it fits very neatly into, we got the Babylonians and then Medo-Persians and the Greeks. And then we come to this fourth one, which would fit for the Roman Empire, which was the legs of iron. And that fits pretty well. But then it appears as though the Roman Empire under the Caesars and this so-called revived Roman Empire of this end times quality are combined together by Daniel, which kind of presents some problems because the Roman Empire was a long, long time ago. And the revived Roman Empire hasn't really happened yet. And why would Daniel and his vision combine them? And some, in answer to that question, in dealing with this problem, some don't see it as being the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, but they see it as these first three, the lion, the bear, and the panther. They see this as being three contemporary consecutive kingdoms that were of the past, that were prophetic when Daniel saw the vision, but they're from history from our perspective. And they see it as three concurrent world powers, or not historic as we are, but three concurrent world powers in during the end times. I mean, why, they would say, would there be this prophecy of Babylon being this lion with wings and everything right before it fell? You know, it's in the days of Belshazzar. And so why would there be, I mean, you could see if it was happening during Nebuchadnezzar's time, but this is many years later. This is like 60 years later. And the Babylonian Empire is kind of on the wane at this point. And why are the Roman Empire and the revived Roman Empire seemingly glommed together in the vision? And so some see it possibly as you got Britain, which of course their symbol is a lion. You actually have a lion on their crest. And the U.S., you know, people say is the U.S. in Bible history, maybe right here, but they see it in the U.S. as, because like our symbol is the eagle. And then of course you got the Russian bear, so that fits pretty easily. And then the panther, or the leopard, trying to figure out what that is. They see it as just some sort of a confederation, a consolidation of some Asian nations. Okay. And then the revived Roman Empire would be this nondescript beast of the fourth one. And that could be, I mean, as I'm saying, some conservative, contemporary, evangelical guys that believe in a pre-trib, premillennial eschatology. That's what some of them hold to. And it is a possibility. If it is true, though, check out what happens to the wings on the lion. They get plucked off. And so if we are the eagle's wings of the vision, it doesn't say much for our future. But he says, as I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom three of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, Daniel was troubled by this. You think? You know, I mean, this is pretty amazing. Now, in eschatology, there are what's known as premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial. And we'll talk about all of this more later, but I'm just going to kind of throw it out now for just as a kind of introductory. But the premillennial people believe that Jesus will come back in order to usher in a millennial reign, that he will physically reign from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. That's a millennium is 1,000 years, and that's what many people believe. And I think that would be the one that would be most tenable. The postmillennial is the view that, and this was really popular back in the 19th century. It waned a lot in the first half of the 20th century because of these two big world wars we had. It's kind of been having a rebound in the 21st century. But this is the view that the church is going to usher in the millennial reign. the millennial kingdom. We will, through our efforts, as we spread out across the world and we Christianize the world, that we will make this a suitable place for Jesus to come back to. That's postmillennialism. And then amillennialism is just that all of these things about the millennium and the physical reign of Christ from earth is just figurative, it's allegorical, and it's just going to go on the way it's going on until someday Jesus comes back, and then that's the end. New heavens, new earth. And everything else about it is either historical or figurative, which and the amillennial and the post-millennial people will always try to take the church and insert them into prophecies like this. They'll try to find some ways that we're the lion and we're the tiger and the bear, kind of a deal. But the church, remember, Paul says in Romans that the church is hidden from the Old Testament. The church isn't in the Old Testament as the body of Christ, as an entity. Just a prophecy that Gentiles would get saved. But the church was hidden from the Old Testament prophets. Eyes, it says this guy is full of eyes. And eyes in prophetic literature always speak of knowledge or wisdom or understanding or, having some brains. And where it says that he's nondescript, he doesn't say that, but I'm saying that because he is nondescript. In the 13th chapter of Revelation, again, commentary on the book of Daniel, it says, and starting with verse 1, and then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name, or pompous words, you could say. Now the beast which I saw was a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear. Does this sound kind of familiar? And his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. It's kind of like Daniel's vision in reverse, isn't it? And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. I mean, really, if you think about how this animal is being described, it sounds like, remember Sid from Toy Story? Kind of sounds like something he would have made. He takes a head from Barbie over here and just puts together some sort of a conglomerate critter, and that's kind of what it sounds like. Now, probably, and we saw this in chapter 2, and I'm going to go into it a little bit tonight and then more in detail in the subsequent weeks, but probably it's talking about some sort of these 10 horns. Horns in Scripture, especially in prophecy, speak of power, and usually it's referring to a ruler. The horn is a ruler or a nation, and it's speaking of some sort of confederation of nations, 10 nations that have somehow gotten together, and it's in some way associated with the old Roman Empire. And I don't think we can really say much more than that. Now, in this, Daniel is getting a little precursor to the visions that he's going to have in the end of the book, where he's seeing a vision of the guy that we've come to know and hate as the Antichrist. That's really not the most biblical terminology for him. Man of sin, son of perdition are probably better names for him, but when you say Antichrist, people know what you're talking about, and so we'll just kind of go with that. But he's seeing that in this revived Roman Empire kind of a thing, this nondescript Sid kind of critter, there's going to be this one horn that's going to come out of the 10, and he's going to rise up and he's going to take over. And this little horn, this horn that comes in and takes over the 10, I think is a prophecy concerning the Antichrist, when he will rise up and take control. And it says there's going to be 3 horns that try to stop him, and he just eats them up. So when the Antichrist comes to power, when that happens, there's going to be 3 groups, 3 nations, something that are going to say no way, and Antichrist is going to say yes way, and he's just going to, that's going to be the end of them. And I watched, verse 9, till the thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated, and his garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, and its wheels a burning fire. Ancient of Days, literally what it means is days without beginning. It's like here's a guy whose day you can't even no birthday, because his days go back before there was even a beginning to have a birthday. By the way, this description of him with hair like wool and everything, this is where the English magistrates today wear those white powdered wigs. And it's because they had, when it first began, I'm sure this is lost on them today. They probably just think it's kind of chic. But the way it started back in the beginning, when Britain started becoming an entity, was the judges saw themselves as the Old Testament judges that Moses raised up. They saw themselves as standing in the place of God, and they wanted to always have that reminder that they were, they had an accountability to what they were doing as ruling over the affairs of men. And so they wore these powdered wigs to remind them of this passage, that they were actually standing in the place of God, that they represented God as judges. And it says in verse 10 that a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him, and thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. This is Bibleese for gods. I mean, this is, if the Bible were, they didn't have the word for millions then, and so if they just, this is billions and gazillions. It's the only way they know how to say something like that. An innumerable host. And they were there before him, and it says the court was seated and the books were opened. I believe this is a prophecy of the judgment prior to the millennium. At the we read about it in Matthew, in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, when at the end of the tribulation period, Jesus comes back, and his very first order of business is this judgment of the nations, or the separation of the sheep and the goat. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. And so the goats go over on the left side, and the sheep go over on the right side, and all the goats go into the lake of fire, and all the sheep get to go with Jesus into the millennium. And I think this is talking of that judgment when Jesus comes back and sets that up. And it doesn't say book. We read in the Bible, especially in prophecy, we read about the book of life. But this is books, plural. And so it is the book of life. That's one of them. That's going to be one of the books that are there that gets opened. But it's also, the other one is going to be the book of works, or the book of deeds. It's going to be all the things because that's, we're not standing in that judgment, but the people at the end of the tribulation will be. And Jesus is going to say, well, inasmuch as you didn't do it unto the least of these, you didn't do it unto me, because it's not written here in the book of your deeds. And so, in the lake of fire. So I think that's what this verse 10 is talking about, that judgment at the end of the tribulation. And I watched then, verse 11, and because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, I watched till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to a burning flame. When Jesus comes back at the end of the tribulation, he's going to take the Antichrist, this beast that Daniel can't see any way to describe, and he's going to toss him into the lake of fire. And that's what this is talking about. Now, there is in the Bible what I believe is called the principle. Some say the law, but I hate using the word law when it's man-made. Principle of double reference. And that is that a prophecy, not every prophecy, but a prophecy can have two references, or two applications, two fulfillments. There can be a near one, or that's kind of partial, and then a later one that is more full, more full bodied. And we have several examples of that in Scripture, and I think this is one of them. Obviously the full fulfillment of it will be the Antichrist, but there is also going to be in Daniel, he's already not going to be because he's already happened, but in Daniel there's going to be this guy that's kind of a foreshadowing, a precursor of the Antichrist, and he's going to be one of those Seleucid kings from Syria that we saw, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies earlier, and his name is Antiochus or Antiochus, and he's Antiochus the fourth, or as he preferred to call himself, Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifested. And he kind of liked that name better. And he is, like, in every sense of the word, an Antichrist, but he's just not the Antichrist, because Jesus in the Olivet Discourse speaks of this guy as still being future. And by the time of Jesus, Antiochus had been gone for almost 200 years. So Antiochus is a precursor to the Antichrist, but he's not the Antichrist. And he's partial fulfillment of this little horn is Antiochus in the middle of the 2nd century BC. But then the full fulfillment of it will be Antichrist at the end of times. And it says, and the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away, and yet their lives were prolonged for a season. Now, some say that this is why we know that there are going to be some sort of future contemporary nations, that they're all coexisting at the same time, because it says that it's still speaking of future, and it says their dominion isn't taken away until after the Antichrist is thrown in the lake of fire. But if we think about it, if they're talking about Babylon and Persia and Greece, Babylon is the how did that's way out of line. Okay, let's see if it's nope. I didn't get it in here, but Iraq is Babylon, right? And it's still around. Iran is Persia, and it's still around. And Greece, you know what Greece is today? It's Greece, and it's kind of, but it is still around, just not very much, but it's kind of still around. And so it could be that it's talking about these three are still there at the end of times, and their dominion's taken away. All three of them ain't about nothing today, and yet they're allowed to be prolonged for a season and a time, however long a season and a time is. So there's that. And he says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. How many know who this guy is? Okay, yeah, not much. He's the Son of Man, So this is God the Son coming to the Ancient of Days, who would presumably be God the Father, which is kind of cool. And they brought him near before him, and then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Something that's really kind of cool. We're going to see this Sunday in Luke chapter 12 that it says that when Jesus comes back, he's going to serve us. Is that wild? That's just wild. But it says that he's been given this dominion, and that all the people from all over the world are going to serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. By the way, this is why the Jews rejected Jesus in his first advent, when he came the first time, because they said, well, he's not a king. The prophecy was that when the Son of Man comes, when the Messiah comes, he's going to be in charge of everything. And look at this guy. He's not in charge of anybody. And this is why they rejected him the first time, because they didn't understand that his kingdom was not of this world. And so I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. Daniel is like, no more pistachio anchovy ice cream before I go to bed. I ain't doing that anymore. No, it was just because of this vision that he'd had. And so I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. And so he told me, one of the angels that was standing around, and he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts, which are four kings, which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. If you think forever is a long time, that's a really long time forever is. But forever and ever, that's even longer. And so that's the way it's going to be. And then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, its nails of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces, and then whatever was left over he trampled with his feet. In fact, the NIV says whatever was left. That's how it translates the word residue. And the 10 horns which were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, or we could say blasphemous words, like Revelation 13:1 says, whose appearance was greater than its fellows. I was watching, and that same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. Now, the amillennial and the premillennial people will point to this and they say, well, this is the church. I mean, here we are talking about end times, and this is in the last days, and there's the church. The church is going through all of that, because it says the saints. But the word saints here is just, am I too late for it? Yeah, there it is. Literally means holy ones, and it's used. I mean, it's used of the Israelis. It's used of angels in the Old Testament, and also the church. So it's in this context, it's speaking of the tribulation saints, not just simply. It's not always the church. And so he's going to be prevailing. This little horn, the Antichrist, is going to be prevailing against the tribulation saints until the Ancient of Days comes. And he's going to come back at the end of this and take care of things, because it says the judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came from the saints to possess the kingdom. And thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms. It's going to devour the whole earth and trample it and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns are 10 kings, which shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them, and he will be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, and shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. I'm not real sure what that means. It could mean that he's going to do some big calendar revision, instead of saying, some say that it's the whole BC AD to BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era. I think it might be even more so. When the Antichrist comes up, he's going to say, no, this is the year 1. We're going to start figuring time from here on out, because he doesn't want it to be about any kind of Common Era or before Jesus or anything like that. He wants it to be about him. But he's going to do something like that. And then the saints shall be given into his hand for times, and half a time. A time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is 6 months. So that'd be 3.5 years, which figures, I know I'm speaking real fast, but that figures a lot into eschatology. Now, in chapter 2, we looked at the history of the European Union, how it had its beginnings, and in the early days, everybody was really excited as soon as it got to that the European Union is the revived Roman Empire. As soon as it got to 10 nations, boy, look out, here's going to come the rapture. Well, there's 28 members of the EU today, so we either got to recount it or something. There's something going on with that. And is the EU part of that 10-nation confederacy that's the revived Roman Empire? I don't know. It's kind of hard to put into 10 right now when you got 28. I mean, you have to get rid of a bunch of them to get back to 10. I don't know what that means. It is kind of interesting that there is a Western European Union that's separate from the EU, the European Union that has the euro, and we all hear about. But there's a Western European Union. And since 1990, guess how many member nations they've had? 10. And that number is fixed, and they don't expect to expand the member nations. They have observers and associates and stuff, but it was basically formed so that they could have a NATO without the U.S. That's really what they wanted to do. They kind of formed it to kick us out. And it's still around. And it's primarily a police sort of a thing. They have a force, and they go and do border control and police actions and things like that. Could that be what it is? Stay tuned. I don't know. But like I said, it's had a static number. I said 1990 since 1995. Verse 26 says, "But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, the little horn, the Antichrist, to consume and destroy it forever. And then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High." Jesus comes back. He's going to throw the Antichrist into the lake of fire, and then he's going to take the world and kind of divide it up among those people. And his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion shall serve and obey him. And this is the end of the account. And as for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me. Or if you got to go King James, his cogitations greatly troubled him. Uh, I didn't know what cogitation was, but I thought it was bad. It doesn't sound good, but I guess it's just thoughts. But he said, my cogitations greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, and I kept the matter in my heart. Now, the Antichrist is going to come, and he's going to attempt to set up a one world government with one currency. You can go anywhere in the world. You don't have to worry about exchange rates and anything like that. And if you think about it, doesn't that sound good? One police force for the whole world, no border disputes, no wars, it's be planet Earth. One government, one money. It is good. That is a great idea. There's nothing wrong with that idea. In fact, I'm longing to see it. I think it's going to be awesome. The problem is that the world's going to pick the wrong guy. They're going to pick the Antichrist. But when Jesus comes back, that's what he's going to do. He's going to have a one world government, and he'll rule and he'll reign, and it'll be pretty sweet. They're just going to pick the wrong one. And if you remember back in chapter 2, as soon as the wise guys of Nebuchadnezzar began speaking, said they spoke in Aramaic. In chapter 2, chapter 2, starting with verse 4. And from then up until verse 28 of chapter 7, all of Daniel's been written in Aramaic. And now it's going to switch back when we get next week to verse 1 of chapter 8. It's going to switch back to Hebrew again, because now before this time, it's been, we could say, the times of the Gentiles prophetically. This has been the time when Babylon and Persia and Greek, but that's about the end. And then prophetically, and then in chapter 8, the attention is going to shift back to the nation of Israel. Let's pray. Kind of exciting, stimulating stuff, Lord, and it does it whets my appetite for more, and I pray that would be for everyone else as well. But I pray, Lord, that above all, that just simply a hunger for eschatology, but we would have a hunger for your return, and that we would long to see all of this come down, so that you will reign, and that truth and righteousness will be your banner. And Lord, we just so look forward to that and want to be prepared in every sense of the word as that day rapidly approaches. So encourage us to that end, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.